12 Navy SEALs, one dry ravine, 40 fighters with machine guns on every ridge. The ambush was perfect. And the only person who saw it coming, a female Army sniper working alone, 2 days deep in hostile jungle, had already been told to shut up and stay out of it. They called her just a recon girl. They dismissed her intelligence reports. They mocked her warnings. They told her to leave the fighting to the real operators. Then the killing started. And 12 men who didn't listen to her suddenly needed her to save their lives. This is the story of Staff Sergeant Rachel Hayes, and the day the battlefield proved every single one of them wrong. If you're new here, hit that subscribe button right now, because the stories we tell on this channel are the ones that don't make the headlines but should. Drop your city and country in the comments. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Like the video, stay until the end, because what happens in that operations center will stay with you. The jungle smelled like rot and rain. It always did in the Ashfang, a dense, lightless stretch of terrain that sat wedged between two river systems in a country that didn't officially exist on any operational map Rachel Hayes had ever been issued. The canopy was thick enough to kill the wind entirely, turning the air underneath into something wet and suffocating. Everything dripped. The bark on the trees dripped. The leaves dripped. Even sound seemed to drip, muffled and compressed, swallowed by the vegetation before it could travel 20 meters. Rachel had been inside it for 51 hours. She'd stopped counting the first time she'd gone that long without a real meal, which was somewhere around her third deployment. Now she cataloged it the way she cataloged everything, clinically, quickly, then filed away so it didn't slow her down. 51 hours in the Ashfang. 2 MREs, one of which she'd eaten cold because heating it would have produced a smell signature. 4 repositions. Approximately 900 meters of slow, deliberate movement through terrain that punished every mistake. 1 spotter notebook filled and then some. She was lying in the upper fork of a massive ironwood tree, 60 feet above the jungle floor, wrapped in a ghillie suit she'd modified herself because the standard issue one caught too much moisture and turned into dead weight by hour 12. Beneath her, the world was a slow green cathedral of movement, animal, vegetable, and now for the past 2 days, human, enemy, human. She raised the scope to her eye, adjusted the magnification, let the crosshair settle. Below and to the northeast, 3 men in mismatched fatigues were setting up what looked like a PKM machine gun nest on a natural rock shelf that jutted from the ridge face. They weren't rushing. That was the thing that had caught her attention initially. They weren't rushing. Men who were nervous rushed. These men were unhurried, deliberate, almost comfortable. They knew something she'd been sent here to find out. They knew someone was coming. She moved the scope left. Another position. 2 men, a tripod-mounted weapon she identified as a DSHK heavy machine gun by the barrel profile and the belt hanging off the left side of the feed tray. They'd cleared a firing lane through the brush that gave them a clean diagonal angle into the ravine below. Rachel moved her scope again. Another position, and another. She reached down slowly, fingers finding the edge of her spotter's notebook without looking, clicked her pen. Added the new position to a hand-drawn diagram that had been growing more complicated for 2 days. She marked the elevation, estimated the range, noted the crew size and weapon type. 40 fighters. She'd counted 40, distributed across 7 discrete positions, all oriented toward a single dry ravine approximately 300 meters below the ridgeline. The ravine was a natural funnel, the kind of terrain feature that looked on a map like a solid movement route. Good cover. Concealed from air. Logical approach from the direction anyone coming from Firebase Keller would use, which was exactly why it was a death trap. She'd transmitted her first report at hour 22. Grid coordinates, enemy force size, weapons identification, estimated engagement range, probable kill zone. The report had gone up the chain through her reconnaissance elements TOC, which relayed to the Joint Operations Center at Keller. The response had come back in 40 minutes. Unable to confirm. Intel assessed as exaggerated. Maintain observation only. Do not engage. She'd stared at the message on her handset for a long moment. Then she'd gone back to her scope and kept counting. At hour 36, she'd transmitted again. Updated enemy positions. Evidence of a command post established behind the eastern ridgeline. Radio traffic she'd intercepted on a secondary channel. She wasn't supposed to have the intercept capability, but she'd built the kit herself from parts she'd sourced over 2 deployments. The traffic was in a dialect she only half understood, but the operational language was universal. The words for wait and ready translated the same in every army on Earth. They were waiting for someone. The response to her second transmission had taken longer, an hour and 10 minutes. When it came, it wasn't a tactical assessment. It was Major Dennis Caldwell. She knew him by reputation before she'd ever met him. He'd passed through her unit's area of operations 6 months earlier, and the story that had followed him like a shadow was that he'd once dressed down a female intelligence analyst in front of an entire planning cell for overcomplicating a straightforward picture. He had a particular theory about combat reconnaissance, that the people who spent the most time observing tended to start seeing things that weren't there. Hayes, this is Caldwell. I'm going to be direct with you. Go ahead, sir. You've been in that jungle for 2 days alone. That does things to perspective. I've seen it before. What you're describing doesn't match anything our other assets have flagged. Not aerial, not SIGINT, not the ground element we had through that sector last week. Sir, I have eyes on the positions. I'm sure you can give me a lot of things. I'm telling you what I'm able to act on. SEAL Team 7 is conducting a deliberate movement through the Ashfang corridor tonight. They've rehearsed this. They have their own reconnaissance. What I don't need is a recon girl with a notebook full of ghosts feeding contact reports that I can't verify and can't use. The words landed the way he'd probably intended them to. Flat and final. A door closing. Rachel kept her voice even. Sir, the kill zone is the ravine at grid. I heard your grid, Hayes. It's noted. Stay on observation. Do not, and I want to be very clear about this, do not attempt to engage anything. Do not communicate on SEAL frequencies. Your job right now is to watch and report. Leave the fighting to people whose job it is to fight. Caldwell out. The radio clicked off. Rachel lowered the handset. She looked down through 60 feet of air at the jungle floor, where a slight movement in the brush marked a small animal, a tree rat or something similar, moving through the leaf litter. Normal. Undisturbed. She looked northeast. The PKM crew had finished their setup, and one of them had pulled out a ration pack. Eating. Comfortable. Patient. Leave the fighting to people whose job it is to fight. She pulled out her own notebook and started running numbers she'd already run 3 times, because the act of running them again was something to do besides sit with the weight of what she knew and couldn't make anyone believe. SEAL Team 7. 7 operators. No, she'd overheard a comms exchange 2 hours earlier that had mentioned a reinforced element. 12. 12 operators moving through the Ashfang corridor. Movement time from their last known staging point to the ravine floor. Approximately 2 hours at a deliberate patrol pace, which meant they'd be in the kill zone around 2140. She looked at her watch. 1947. She closed the notebook. Rachel Hayes had come to this particular hill through a route that most people who knew her history found either impressive or alarming, depending on who was doing the assessment. She'd grown up in Rapid City, South Dakota, which meant she'd grown up around firearms the way some kids grow up around sports equipment. They were just there, familiar, part of the texture of everyday life. Her father had been a competitive shooter before his knee made standing for long periods a problem, and he'd passed to her something more useful than technique. He'd passed her an understanding of patience as a skill, not a personality trait. The ability to hold still and wait wasn't something you were born with. It was something you built, deliberately, over time, the same way you built trigger control or breath management. She'd enlisted at 21, after 2 years of college that had felt simultaneously expensive and inadequate. The Army had immediately placed her on an administrative track, processing paperwork, at a garrison somewhere in Georgia. And she'd immediately begun the process of not accepting that. She'd submitted her first application for sniper school 14 months into her service. It had been denied. She'd submitted again. Denied. Third time, she'd requested a face-to-face with her battalion commander, a colonel named Okafor, who'd had the look of a man who expected to be annoyed and then hadn't been. She'd laid out her qualification scores, her physical assessment results, and a 3-page written argument that she hadn't been asked for but had prepared anyway. Colonel Okafor had read the 3 pages. Looked up. "Why do you want this?" he'd asked. "Because I'm good at it," she'd said. "And because people are going to get shot at regardless of whether I'm the one behind a rifle. I'd rather be the one behind the rifle." He'd approved the application. She'd finished sniper school ranked second in her class, which was the best she could do given that the evaluation included a subjective performance component scored by two instructors who had openly expressed, on the first day, that they considered female candidates a problem to be managed rather than a resource to be developed. She'd considered complaining. She'd considered a lot of things. In the end, she'd done what she always did, pointed herself at the problem and worked. 3 deployments after that. 2 to regions she couldn't name in polite company. 1 to a forward advisory mission that had turned into something considerably less advisory by day 4. She'd come back from all 3, which was not a guarantee the job offered, and she'd built a reputation in her reconnaissance element as someone you wanted on the glass when the picture wasn't clear, which was exactly what she'd been doing in the Ashfang for 51 hours, and exactly what no one at the Joint Operations Center seemed to want to acknowledge. At 2023, she heard them, not their voices. The Ashfang swallowed voices at any real distance. She heard the sound of a patrol moving through vegetation, the specific, unmistakable rhythm of a tactical column, the careful footfalls spaced to minimize noise but still producing it, the occasional soft crackle that no amount of training fully eliminated. She identified it at maybe 400 meters, bearing southwest, moving northeast, moving toward the ravine. She keyed her radio. The reconnaissance element's frequency. Actual, this is Hayes. SEAL element is in the corridor. I have 40-plus enemy in established positions oriented on the ravine. Request immediate authority to engage. The response was not her TOC. It was Caldwell again. Hayes, you were given your instructions. Sir, they're going to be inside the kill zone in less than 20 minutes. I have eyes on 7 crew-served weapons. They do not have a functional escape route once they're in the ravine floor. SEAL Team 7 has their own situational awareness, Hayes. They have, Sir. She didn't raise her voice. She'd learned a long time ago that raising your voice in a radio transmission accomplished nothing except making you sound like you'd lost control. She kept it flat and precise. I am in the canopy directly above the kill zone. I have been watching these positions for 2 days. The lead element is going to reach the first bend in the ravine at approximately 2042, and when they do, at least 4 interlocking fires will engage them simultaneously. I am requesting authority to engage now, before that happens. Silence on the line. Then, maintain your position. Do not engage. If SEAL 7 makes contact, they will break contact per their own SOPs. The radio clicked off. Rachel lowered the handset. She pressed 2 fingers against her temple, not from pain, but from the specific frustration of a clear picture that nobody wanted to look at. She looked at her watch, 2026. She looked down through the scope at the ravine floor, then at the PKM position on the northeast ridge, then at the DSHK crew, who had finished their meal and were now repositioning the barrel slightly, a final adjustment for the expected angle of engagement. The enemy commander had done his job well. Whatever intelligence they had on the SEAL element's movement, it was good. They knew the route. They knew the timing. They'd built interlocking fires that would create overlapping kill zones on the ravine floor with no dead ground to shelter in. The escape routes, both of them, were covered by the flanking positions she'd marked on day 1. This wasn't an ambush. It was a verdict. At 2038, the first SEAL appeared at the northern mouth of the ravine. Rachel recognized the kit before she could identify the man. Plate carrier, suppressed rifle. The specific way a trained operator moved through terrain, weight forward, weapon up, eyes everywhere. He was good. They were all good. She could tell that even at this distance, even in the fading light, they moved with the kind of quiet competence that only came from real repetition, thousands of hours of training and real-world application, the kind of operators who'd earned the right to be confident. They were walking into something they couldn't see. She watched the element file through the northern entrance, counted them. 12. All in, no rear element hanging back. That was the trap. The ravine was wide enough at the entrance that it looked manageable, and the walls angled gradually enough that by the time the element reached the center, they'd be fully committed and the escape geometry would have closed around them. The lead element reached the first bend. Rachel's hand was already on the radio. She switched frequencies, not her Recon element's frequency, not the JOC frequency. A different one she wasn't supposed to have. One she'd memorized from a coordination brief 6 weeks earlier when the SEAL element had been at Keller for a joint planning session and she'd been assigned to the liaison cell, one of the more invisible positions that people in operations tended to occupy. She keyed the transmission. SEAL 7, this is Army Sniper Hayes. I am in the canopy at grid November Kilo 447. I have eyes on enemy positions in your current AO. You are inside a prepared kill zone. Do not advance. 3 seconds of silence. Then a voice. Controlled, but tight. The voice of someone who'd heard something surprising on a frequency where he hadn't expected to hear anything. Who is this? Authenticate. I can't authenticate on this net, and you know it. I'm the sniper your command told to stand down 2 hours ago. I have been watching 40 enemy fighters set up interlocking positions on both ridge lines for 2 days. The fire control measures are oriented on your current position. If your lead element rounds the second bend, you will be engaged from at least 4 directions simultaneously. I am in a position to suppress 2 of those positions before you're in contact. Request authority to engage now. Another pause. Long. Then, what's your position? Ironwood cluster, 60 feet, north side of the ravine, bearing 172 from your lead element's current position. A different voice came on. Quieter. More deliberate. This is 7 actual. I'm listening. You've got a PKM at grid. She gave him the position, then the next one, then the next, methodical and fast. The information she'd spent 2 days building delivered in under 90 seconds. She heard him repeating the grids, presumably to someone beside him who was marking them. When she finished, there was a pause. You've been up there 2 days? Yes. And your command told you to stand down? Yes. Another pause. She could hear the weight of it on the other end. A man rapidly recalculating, weighing the information against the source, trying to decide how much risk he was willing to accept on the word of a voice from a frequency it shouldn't be on. If this is real, it's real, sir. She paused for one breath. I have a clear shot on the lead machine gun position. On your authority, I can take it before they initiate. It will give your element approximately 15 seconds to find cover and orient before the secondary positions open up. That's the window. Silence. The lead SEAL element had stopped moving. She could see them on the ravine floor, stationary, compressed into a loose perimeter. Someone had made a hand signal. Someone had heard something in the way 7 actual sounded on the radio. Good instincts. Good team. The PKM crew on the northeast. The muzzle brake redirected most of the gas, but not the noise. And the noise was its own kind of announcement, a statement to every living thing within half a kilometer that something large and final had just happened. The PKM gunner dropped without a sound she could hear at this distance. She was already cycling the bolt. The second crew member, the loader, who'd been crouched to the gunner's left managing the ammunition belt, spun toward the sound. He was looking in the wrong direction. She was 60 feet up and 400 meters away, and he was looking at the ravine floor where the SEAL element had been visible. Her second shot caught him as he was still turning. The PKM position went silent. She was already moving the scope. Northeast Ridgeline, DSHK crew. The gunner was up, had heard the Barrett, was scanning. She could see him talking. His mouth was moving, probably into a radio, calling the contact location to the command post behind the ridge. That radio call was the priority. Let the command post understand what was happening and they'd adapt the plan. Keep the command post confused, and the ambush structure started to fall apart. She put the crosshair on the radio operator standing 2 feet to the DSHK gunner's left. Third shot. The radio operator went down hard. The DSHK gunner threw himself behind his weapon's protective shield, not much, a thin piece of steel plate, and started scanning the canopy on the wrong side of the ravine. She had perhaps 30 seconds before someone on the ground triangulated the muzzle blast. On the ravine floor below, she could see the SEAL element breaking into action. They'd moved the instant her first shot fired. Not away, not backward, but laterally, pressing against the base of the ravine walls where the interlocking fires had the weakest coverage. Someone down there had very quickly understood what she was doing and had responded in kind. Breaking the geometrically designed kill zone by denying the enemy the position she was picking apart. Good. The first secondary position, Western Ridge, 2 riflemen with an RPG, opened up. Not at her. At the ravine floor. The ambush was initiating anyway, or at least the elements that hadn't lost their key personnel yet were initiating. The RPG round hit the ravine floor 15 meters from the rearmost SEAL element and threw rock and dust in every direction. She heard the distant crack of it, even over the environmental noise. She put her scope on the RPG position. The gunner was already reloading. His assistant was feeding him the next round. She fired. The assistant went down. The RPG gunner looked up, looked directly at her, or close enough that it didn't matter, and she put her crosshair on his chest and fired again. The western ridge position fell quiet. 4 shots, 4 down. Maybe 8 seconds elapsed. On the radio, she'd left the frequency open. She could hear voices. SEAL element moving, calling positions, coordinating. The controlled chaos of trained people in contact. Someone called out a bearing on another enemy position. Someone else confirmed. The voices were tight and professional, and under the kind of pressure that stripped everything down to function. Then 7 actual came on. Hayes, West Ridge is clear. 2 active positions, north and south. Can you reach the north? She was already looking at it. Yes, give me 12 seconds. You have 10. She appreciated the honesty. The north position was a 2-man team with AKs, lighter than the crew-served weapons, but positioned at an angle that gave them a direct line on the section of ravine wall where 3 SEALs had taken cover. She could see one of them already shifting to engage. 9 seconds. She settled the crosshair. 8. Pressed. The shot went slightly right. She'd been rushing and felt it in the trigger brake, the slight deviation of her finger pressure pulling the impact off center, but slightly right at this range still hit. The first man went down. The second spun and opened fire. Not at the SEALs. At the canopy. At her. The rounds came through the ironwood's upper branches in a random, uncoordinated burst. He didn't have her exact position. He was shooting at the area where the muzzle blast had originated, which meant shooting at maybe 30 meters of canopy and hoping. A branch 2 feet to her left took a round and sprayed bark. Another round passed somewhere overhead with a sound like a hornet. A third hit the trunk of the tree she was in, and she felt the impact vibrate up through the bark beneath her. She didn't move. Moving would give him something to track. Her ghillie suit and the canopy above her absorbed most of her visual signature. She was, to anyone looking up from ground level without optics, essentially invisible. A texture variation in 100 square meters of identical texture. She waited. He fired again. Still scattered, still no closer. She put the crosshair on his muzzle flash, pressed. The second man dropped. The north position went quiet. North is clear, she transmitted. Copy. South position is maneuvering. They're moving 2 men toward the ravine exit. I see them. She did. 2 figures moving fast through the brush on the southern ridgeline, breaking from their prepared position, abandoning the ambush structure and trying to cut off the ravine's southern exit before the SEAL element could use it. Smart. Adaptive. The ambush was deteriorating, and someone down there still had their head together. She tracked them through the scope, moving targets in broken terrain at 400 and something meters. This was different from a static target. The variables multiplied: lateral speed, terrain undulation affecting the line of sight, vegetation intermittently breaking the visual track. She led the first figure by the amount the calculation demanded, made the adjustment automatic rather than deliberate, and pressed. Missed. She exhaled, cycled. The second figure had heard the shot and changed direction, no longer moving in a straight line, breaking left, then right, using the terrain intelligently. She tracked, led again, pressed. The second figure went down. She moved back to the first. He'd gone to ground in the brush somewhere in the 40 meters between his last visible position and the ravine wall. She scanned. Nothing obvious. She marked the approximate area in her memory and moved on. A man pinned in the brush wasn't the same threat as a man actively maneuvering. On the ravine floor, the SEAL element was moving. She could see them now in fragments through the canopy gaps. Coordinated movement south, toward the extraction corridor. 2 men supporting a third who was moving with a limp. Someone was hit. Not down, but hit. She watched them move and felt the specific tension of wanting to know and not being able to ask right now. The radio. Hayes, we have 2 wounded. We're pushing south. What's between us and the extraction corridor? She moved her scope methodically. Scanned the southern approach. The 2 maneuvering fighters, 1 down, 1 in the brush. The 3 remaining intact positions she'd identified from her 2 days of observation. 2 of them were on the eastern ridgeline, oriented northeast, which meant they were looking the wrong direction for the SEAL element's new movement line. They hadn't updated their sectors yet. Two residual positions, East Ridge. They're oriented the wrong way. You'll have a window of maybe 40 seconds once you clear the ravine exit before they adjust. South of the ravine, your corridor is approximately 80 meters of open ground before you reach the wood line. I don't have eyes on the wood line from here. Copy. 80 meters of open. We can work with that. The fighter I missed is in the brush at your 9 o'clock, approximately 30 meters from the ravine wall. He's pinned, but he's there. Copy. We'll handle it. The SEAL element moved. She watched them come through the southern exit, all 12 of them, or what she could see of them, and start across the open ground. One man was being assisted, an arm over another operator's shoulders, moving faster than it looked comfortable. Two other men had turned to face backward, covering the approach. They moved with the kind of precision that made watching them feel like watching something that had been choreographed, even though it hadn't been, even though it was pure training and discipline and the terrible focus that came from knowing that stopping meant dying. She kept her scope on the eastern ridgeline. The two intact positions were still oriented northeast. She watched one of the gunners start to turn. He'd heard something, or sensed the shift in the engagement, and she put the crosshair on him and held it, waiting to see if he'd fully reorient before the SEAL element reached the wood line. He did. She pressed. He dropped. The second man at that position turned toward the canopy, raising his weapon. She was already cycling. Pressed again. He went down. The second eastern position never moved. Whoever was in command there either hadn't received the updated information about the SEAL element's movement or had decided to hold their sector. Either way, the SEAL element cleared the 80 meters and hit the wood line before anyone had a shot. The radio. Wood line. All 12, two walking wounded. We're moving to extraction. Rachel exhaled. She hadn't noticed how completely she'd locked down her breathing until the moment she released it. Her hands were steady. They were always steady, which was the thing she could never fully explain to anyone. Not that there was no fear, because there was, but that the fear didn't live in her hands. It lived somewhere deeper and quieter, in the space behind her sternum, and it was manageable and familiar, and it didn't interfere with the trigger. She did a slow scan of the ridge lines. 3 confirmed silent positions, 1 fighter in the brush, she checked. Still there, not moving. Whether he was waiting or wounded or simply terrified, she couldn't tell at this distance. The ambush structure was destroyed. 40 fighters, 7 prepared positions, 2 days of enemy planning, and in the space of maybe 6 minutes, it had come apart. Not because of air support, not because of reinforcements, because of one woman in a ghillie suit. 60 feet up an ironwood tree with a rifle she'd hauled into this jungle by herself. She started scanning for her next problem, because she already knew there was one. She'd been listening to the broken radio traffic she could intercept, fragments, partial transmissions, the electronic noise of a command post that had just watched its plan disintegrate. And in the fragments, between the calls she could only half translate, she'd caught something specific enough to understand without translation. A grid, and then a word she knew in 7 languages. Intercept. She looked at the map board strapped to her forearm, found the grid, compared it to what she knew of the terrain. The extraction point. The helicopter landing zone that SEAL 7 was currently moving toward. Her stomach didn't drop. She'd trained herself out of that reaction years ago, the physical loss of composure that happened when a situation revealed itself to be worse than you'd thought. But something in her chest recalculated quickly. The mental math of distance and time and what 12 men, 2 of them wounded, moving through the Ashfang at their best pace, would look like when they arrived at a landing zone that was already occupied. She pulled out her handset, checked her own position on the map. The extraction point was approximately 600 meters southeast. She was approximately 450 meters from it. If the enemy had a reinforcement element, and the grid she'd intercepted suggested they did, something pre-positioned or moving now, they might reach the LZ in 15 to 20 minutes. The SEAL element, moving in with 2 casualties, probably wouldn't arrive before 25. She thought about that arithmetic for a moment. 1 rifle, 1 sniper, 600 meters of jungle. She looked at her weapon. The Barrett had a half-empty magazine. She'd fired 9 rounds. She had 2 full magazines in her rig and a partial in the rifle. She had her secondary weapon, a Mk-12 SPR, slung across her back, with 3 magazines. She had a sidearm she hadn't touched. She checked the Barrett's bolt, felt the mechanism, solid. She looked down from the tree at the jungle floor 60 feet below. Then she looked southeast. She started climbing down. The radio crackled as her boots hit the first branch on the descent. 7 Actual's voice, quiet, fast. The voice of a man who just received information he didn't like. Hayes, we're getting reports of a secondary element, possible intercept at the LZ. Our exfil is in 22 minutes and we cannot miss that window. She was already moving through the lower branches. I know, she said into the handset. I'm already moving. A pause. Moving where? To the LZ. Another pause. Longer. Hayes, that's 400 meters of jungle, and you've been up there for 2 days. I know how long I've been up here, sir. She dropped the last 6 feet to the ground, absorbing the landing through her knees, and immediately began moving southeast at a pace that was not quite a run and not quite not one. The specific gait of someone covering ground fast, while keeping enough control to be useful when they arrived. The jungle closed around her. Branches. Roots. The specific resistance of vegetation that didn't want to be moved through. The weight of the Barrett on its sling, the SPR across her back, the rig that was heavier than she'd let herself acknowledge while she'd been stationary and could distribute its weight against the tree. She moved. Behind her, on the ridgeline she'd just spent 6 minutes systematically dismantling, something stirred. The radio intercept she'd been tracking for 2 days had never included a third force, a reserve, a contingency. She hadn't known about it. And now, somewhere behind her in the Ashfang, 20 additional fighters were beginning to move. She ran. Not the clean, efficient run of someone on a track or a training course. The Ashfang didn't allow that. She ran the way the jungle permitted, lurching left around a root mass, ducking under a branch that materialized out of the dark at face level, stepping over a section of ground that looked solid and wasn't, the soft give beneath her boot announcing a subsurface void she didn't want to know more about. The Barrett swung on its sling and hit her hip on every third stride, and the SPR across her back kept catching on vegetation and pulling her sideways in the rig. 60-some pounds of ammunition, water, and field equipment compressed her lungs from the top every time she pushed into a climb. She'd been in the tree for 51 hours. Her legs knew it. The first 200 meters were the worst. Her body had been locked in a sniper's compression. Minimal movement, controlled breathing, every muscle calibrated for stillness rather than effort. And transitioning from that state to full exertion in under 30 seconds produced a specific kind of physical protest that she'd learned to interpret as information rather than complaint. Her quads burned in a way that told her they were working. Her shoulders ached under the weapon weight in a way that told her the muscles were engaged and functional. Her lungs pulled air in the thick, wet Ashfang atmosphere and complained about the quality of what they were getting, and she filed that complaint away and kept moving. 450 meters to the LZ. In terrain like this, at the pace she could actually sustain, that was maybe 12 minutes. She had less than that if the intercept grid she'd pulled from the radio traffic was accurate. The radio crackled against her chest. 7. Actual. Hayes, sit rep. She didn't answer. Answering required slowing enough to manage the transmission clearly, and she couldn't afford the seconds. She keyed twice, the standard acknowledgement pulse that meant heard, moving, and kept going. The jungle shifted around her. She'd spent 2 days building a mental map of the terrain from 60 feet up, and she found herself using it now without fully deciding to, angling right to avoid the drainage gully she'd identified on day 1, cutting left to use the natural corridor between 2 stands of ironwood that would be faster than pushing through the secondary brush. The map in her head was imperfect, constructed from elevation and angle rather than ground level, but it was better than nothing, and in this kind of terrain better than nothing meant the difference between 12 minutes and 15. She broke through a section of dense fern and nearly ran directly into a tree, caught herself, adjusted, kept moving. Her boot came down on a root and her ankle flexed sideways. Not a roll, not enough to do real damage, but enough that she felt the warning signal shoot up through the joint and into her knee. She ignored it the way she'd been ignoring her body's various communications for the past 2 days and redirected her attention to the compass bearing she was holding by memory and dead reckoning because she couldn't afford to stop and check the map board on her forearm. She was carrying too much to run well. She knew that. She also knew she wasn't going to drop any of it, because every kilogram she was carrying represented a specific capability she might need in the next 10 minutes. and arriving light and unprepared was a different kind of failure than arriving slow. At 300 meters, she heard the LZ, not fighting, not yet. What she heard was the particular quality of silence that came from a space where the ambient jungle noise had been suppressed. Animals went quiet when humans moved through an area. The cessation of bird sound and insect sound and the small mechanical movements of the forest ecosystem was its own kind of signal, and what she was hearing from the southeast had the compressed, held quality of a space that had recently been entered by something that didn't belong there. She slowed. Not stopped. Slowed. There was a difference. She moved the Barrett from its sling carry to a two-handed grip, dropped her pace to something that produced less noise, started using the ground more carefully, placing each foot with the deliberate, rolling, heel-to-toe movement that the Ashfang's leaf litter required to avoid the snap and crunch that could travel 30 meters in still air. At 250 meters, she found a sight line through a gap in the canopy. The LZ was a rough clearing approximately 40 meters across. Natural, not cut, the result of a dead tree that had come down years ago and opened a hole in the canopy that the undergrowth hadn't fully reclaimed. The ground was uneven, crossed by the half-buried root system of the fallen tree, tufted with grass and low fern. Not ideal for a helicopter landing, but usable. She'd identified it from her canopy position on day one as the probable extraction point based on the terrain and the approach corridors. She'd been right. She'd also been right about the intercept element. Through the gap, she counted. 6 men at the LZ perimeter, positioned at the tree line, facing outward. Another 4 deeper in. She could see movement, the subtle shift of bodies that weren't quite stationary. And at the far edge of the clearing, partially screened by a section of standing brush, something that resolved itself through her scope into the outline of a PKM on a bipod, oriented toward the northern approach. The northern approach. The direction the SEAL element would be coming from. 10 men. Probably more she couldn't see from this angle. She checked her watch. 19 minutes to exfil window. She keyed the radio. 7 actual, this is Hayes. LZ is compromised. I count 10 plus enemy, 1 crew-served weapon, oriented north. They're expecting you. A pause. The kind of pause that contained a rapid recalculation. Copy. Alternate LZ? She thought. She'd memorized the terrain. There was a secondary clearing approximately 400 meters east, smaller, less accessible, but the enemy commander might not have positioned a force there if his primary asset was here. Might not. There's a secondary site 400 east. I haven't been able to confirm it's clean. Can you clean the primary? She looked at the LZ through the gap. 10 confirmed. Unknown additional. 1 crew served. 1 rifle. I can suppress long enough for you to get your element across the clearing and into the helicopters. It won't be clean. They'll return fire. That's all we need. Give us 4 minutes to get into position. Copy. Come in from the northeast. There's a root mass on the north side of the clearing. Use it as your assault line. When I open up, you'll have maybe 8 seconds before they reorganize. Your wounded go first, straight to the birds. Understood. 4 minutes. She started moving toward a firing position. She found it 40 meters from the LZ perimeter. A slight rise in the ground covered by fern, with a natural gap in the vegetation that gave her a firing lane across roughly 60% of the clearing. Not perfect. Enough. She settled into the prone, arranged the Barrett's bipod on the rise, and began ranging the enemy positions through the scope. The PKM first. Always the crew-served weapon first. She marked it. 210 meters. Clean shot on the gunner. Second priority? The man she identified as the position commander. The only one of the 10 visible figures who was moving rather than static, circling the perimeter, checking positions. A man who was checking positions 3 minutes before an expected contact was a man who was managing his element's readiness. Eliminate him, and the element's coordination degraded. Third priority? The 2 men she could see closest to the northern approach. When the SEALs came in, these would be the first to engage. She built the sequence in her head. PKM gunner, commander, north position left, north position right. Then whatever presented itself. The jungle around her dripped. She controlled her breathing. In through the nose, out through the mouth. Slow. Not because she was trying to calm herself. She'd never fully bought the idea that snipers were calm. Not really. Not at the mechanical level. but because the breath was the bridge between the mind and the finger, and the bridge had to be steady. 1 minute. She thought about the radio intercepts she'd pulled earlier, the third force, the 20 fighters she'd identified as moving somewhere behind her. She hadn't transmitted that information to 7 Actual yet because she hadn't had time to confirm their route or their objective, and transmitting unconfirmed intelligence in the middle of an active contact was how you created confusion that got people killed. But they were out there. She'd have to deal with that problem after this one. 2 minutes. A bird called somewhere in the canopy above her, something small and loud and completely indifferent to the geometry of violence being constructed beneath it. She found that detail oddly steadying. The bird's indifference, the jungle's total disregard for what was about to happen in this particular clearing. The world was enormous, and the Ashfang was just one piece of it, and this clearing was a smaller piece still, and whatever happened here in the next 4 minutes would be significant to exactly the people in it and no one else. She settled the crosshair on the PKM gunner's shoulder blades. 3 minutes. On the radio she heard the SEAL element, not transmitting, but the background sound of a moving patrol, the faint and controlled noise of 12 men and all their equipment navigating terrain, getting close. 60 seconds, 7 Actual said quietly. She pressed the transmit key twice. Then she waited. She watched the PKM gunner shift on his bipod, adjusting his position slightly. He was looking north. He'd heard something, or thought he had, and his body language had changed from patient waiting to active attention. His back had straightened. His hands had found the weapon's grip. He was about to be proved right. "Hayes, execute," 7 Actual said. She pressed the trigger. The Barrett fired and the PKM gunner dropped sideways off his bipod and the weapon fell silent before it had ever spoken. She was already cycling. The position commander, she found him in the scope in less than 2 seconds, had his position memorized, crosshair on his chest as he spun toward the sound of her shot. He was fast, she gave him that. He'd already identified the general direction of the muzzle blast and was raising his radio. She pressed again. He went down and the radio went with him. North position left. She moved the scope. The man was already dropping to a knee, bringing his weapon up, looking north where he expected the threat. He was looking entirely the wrong direction. She put the crosshair on him and fired. North position right had understood something was wrong. He was moving, laterally, fast, braking for better cover. She tracked him, led the movement, pressed, missed. He made the cover, a section of the fallen tree's root mass, a dense tangle of wood and earth that would stop a rifle round. She marked his position and moved on. Pinned wasn't eliminated, but it was managed. From the north side of the clearing, the SEAL element came in hard. She saw them in her peripheral vision while keeping her scope on the remaining enemy positions. A fast-moving line of operators, low and fast, crossing the root tangle assault line she'd described. 2 operators were helping a third. The rest were up and moving with their weapons, identifying targets, engaging. The remaining 6 visible enemy fighters reacted. 2 of them opened fire toward the SEAL element. She engaged the nearer one, hit, and the second shifted fire toward her position as the muzzle blast from her shot gave her away. Rounds came through the fern in a burst, high and scattered, but one of them cut through the vegetation 6 inches above her head, and she heard it distinctly, a sound like a finger snap next to her ear. She pressed flat. The burst continued. The shooter was walking his fire down, the classic suppression technique, trying to bracket the target. She had maybe 3 seconds before the rounds found her elevation. She rolled right, 2 full body lengths, came back into the prone at a different position. The burst ended. Whoever was firing had lost her. She found him in the scope. He was scanning. She was in different vegetation now, and the fern was thick enough that she was functionally invisible again. And he knew she was somewhere in this section of jungle, but not exactly where. She gave him the exact where. The shot caught him center mass and he went down, and she was already moving the scope again. The SEAL element had crossed half the clearing. The 2 operators supporting the wounded man had broken into an almost run, sacrificing noise discipline for speed. She could hear the helicopters now, distant, approaching, the deep mechanical thrum of rotors that had been holding a standoff orbit somewhere to the southeast. The remaining fighters, she counted 4 still active, were caught between the SEAL element hitting them from the north and her fire from the west. 2 of them made the same decision simultaneously, They turned and ran south into the tree line. She let them run. Not because she couldn't have taken the shots. She probably could have, at this range, on moving targets in broken terrain, maybe 1 out of 2. But because the SEAL element needed the clearing held, not the jungle beyond it, and because 2 men running south were not the same threat as 2 men returning fire. The last 2 fighters had gone to ground somewhere near the eastern perimeter of the clearing. She couldn't get a clean sight line on them from her position. She could see where they were by the bursts they were producing, short, controlled, not panicked, aimed at the SEAL element as they reached the tree line on the clearing's far side where the helicopters were setting down. She transmitted. 7 actual, 2 fighters, eastern perimeter, you're 3 o'clock. I don't have the angle. Copy, we've got them. 2 seconds later, 2 of the SEAL operators peeled right and engaged the eastern position. She watched the exchange in fragments through the scope. Muzzle flashes, a burst of return fire, then nothing. The eastern position went quiet. The helicopters were down. She watched the SEAL element load, the wounded first, as she'd specified, the rest following with the disciplined urgency of people who knew that a helicopter on the ground was a helicopter that could be hit. 12 operators. She counted them by habit, the same way she counted everything. All 12. The first helicopter lifted. The second was still loading. From the south, from the tree line where she'd let the 2 fighters run, she heard movement. Not 2 men. More than 2 men. She turned her scope south. The brush on the southern edge of the clearing was moving. Not randomly. The specific coordinated movement of a formed element pushing through vegetation toward an objective. The third force. She keyed the radio. 7 actual. We see it. Second bird is up. We're clear. She looked up from the scope. The 2 helicopters were climbing, banking east, the sound of their rotors changing pitch as they accelerated away from the ashfang and toward whatever safe airspace existed on the other side of the ridgeline. In 20 seconds, they were gone. Not gone silent. The rotors were still audible, but gone visible, swallowed by the canopy and the distance. The clearing was empty. She was alone in the jungle with a third force pushing through the southern tree line. She counted the movement signatures. She'd said 20 in her earlier transmission, and now, watching the brush, she revised that estimate upward. 25. Maybe more. They'd been moving fast, probably in response to the radio contact from the ambush, trying to reach the LZ before the helicopters lifted. And they were close now, 30 meters from the clearing's edge, and they were going to come through that tree line in the next 60 seconds and find a cleared LZ and no SEALs, and somewhere in the fern to their west, 1 Army sniper with a partial magazine in her Barrett and 2 full magazines in her rig. She had a decision to make. She could stay and fight, which was a way of describing something that was really more accurately called staying and dying, because 25 fighters against 1 sniper in close terrain was not a tactical problem with a solution involving her survival. She could evade north, back toward the ridge positions she'd cleared, using the terrain she'd memorized, which meant moving away from any friendly position in a jungle that was now actively searching for her. Or she could do what she'd been doing since she'd climbed down from that tree. Move and think and figure it out on the way. She was already pulling back from the firing position when the first fighters broke through the southern tree line. She heard them, voices, the crash of men moving quickly through brush, someone giving a command in the dialect she half understood. She kept her head down and moved north into the fern, low and fast, controlling her noise output by pure discipline. Behind her, she heard them reach the clearing, heard the confusion, the rapid-fire exchanges of men finding an empty LZ, no bodies, no wreckage, nothing to account for what they'd been told was happening here. Someone was angry. She could hear it in the cadence of the voice, even without understanding the words. She kept moving. 200 meters north of the LZ, she found a secondary ridge, a smaller one, not the main feature, more of a long spine of ground that rose 4 meters above the surrounding jungle floor. She climbed it quickly and settled at its crest and pulled out the handset. 7 actual. Hayes, you're not on the bird. It wasn't a question. He knew she wasn't on the bird because there had been 12 seats and 12 operators and no room she'd been offered. Negative. We're 2 minutes out. I can redirect, but negative. She kept her voice level. You've got 2 wounded on board. Don't redirect. I'll find my own way out. A silence. A long one by radio standards. Hayes, the third force reached the LZ. 25 plus. They're oriented on the clearing right now. By the time you redirect and come back, I'll need to be in a completely different position anyway. I'll contact my TOC and arrange extraction. Another silence. You have a plan? I have a direction, she said, which was not the same thing but was the most honest answer she could give. Northeast. There's a river crossing at Grid. She checked the map board. November Kilo 481. If I can reach it, I can follow the river south to the valley and flag a resupply bird. That's 6 kilometers. I know how far it is, sir. The radio was quiet for a moment. Then 7 Actual said something she didn't expect. What's your call sign? She paused. Hayes. Rachel Hayes, Staff Sergeant. Staff Sergeant Hayes, a beat. We're going to have a conversation when you're out. Yes, sir. Don't get yourself killed before that. The radio clicked off. She lay on the ridge crest for 30 seconds, listening to the jungle below. The third force was still at the LZ. She could hear them, distant but present, the sound of organized movement as they began to spread out and search. They were going to start working outward from the clearing in expanding arcs. Standard search doctrine, which meant she had maybe 8 minutes before the nearest element reached her current position, 6 kilometers to the river. She did the math quickly and didn't like the answer. She adjusted the Barrett's sling, rolled off the ridge crest on the north side, and started moving. The ashfang closed around her like a hand. She thought about Caldwell's voice on the radio. Leave the fighting to people whose job it is to fight. She thought about the way the PKM gunner had been adjusting his barrel for the angle on the SEAL element's position. The specific patient adjustment of a man who knew exactly who was coming and exactly what he was going to do. She thought about 12 operators who were on helicopters right now instead of in a ravine. And then she stopped thinking about any of it, because thinking required a portion of attention that the terrain was currently claiming entirely, and the ashfang didn't care about anything she was processing. It only cared about whether she was watching where she was putting her feet. She watched where she was putting her feet. At 300 meters from the LZ, she heard the search element behind her reach the ridge. At 400 meters, she heard them find the depression in the fern where she'd been lying. She moved faster. The jungle got darker as the last of the ambient light filtered down through the canopy. She'd lost track of time during the contact, had stopped checking her watch because the watch had stopped mattering. The way clocks stop mattering when the present moment becomes sufficiently demanding. It was full dark, or close to it, and the ashfang in darkness was a different problem than the ashfang in any form of light. She switched to her nods, night observation device, clipped to her helmet mount, and the world went green and dimensional and slightly unreal, the way the world always looked through the monocular tube of a night vision device. Distances compressed and shadows deepened and everything existing in a spectrum that felt like looking through someone else's eyes. She kept moving. Behind her, she heard something that stopped her cold. Not the search element. She'd been tracking their sound and they were still 100 meters south. Something else. To her east. Parallel to her movement. She froze. Listened. The ashfang dripped and rustled, and somewhere high in the canopy, a nocturnal animal moved through the branches. But beneath that, beneath the natural texture of the jungle at night, there was the unmistakable rhythm of human movement, controlled, directional, moving north, same as her. They'd flanked her. She stood completely still and let the information settle into something she could work with. The search element behind her, pushing north. A flanking element to her east, moving parallel. Standard pursuit doctrine, pressure from the rear, flanking force to cut off the avenue of escape, converge on the target from 2 directions, which meant there was probably a third element. She looked north. She couldn't see anything through the NODs at this distance in this vegetation, but she understood the geometry. If she were running this pursuit, the third element would be moving to a blocking position somewhere north of her current location, trying to set up a cordon before she reached it. The river was the obvious limit of exploitation. Once she reached the river, she had options. Before the river, she was in the box they were building around her. She had to go west. She turned. West meant back toward the LZ, back toward the main force, which was why they probably hadn't covered it. The predictable move was away from the threat, not toward it. And sometimes the predictable move was predictable because it was correct, but sometimes the predictable move was what the enemy was counting on. She moved west, faster now. The NODs helped with the terrain navigation, but the weight of the full kit was settling into her body in a way that had moved past discomfort into something more structural. Her lower back had been talking to her for an hour and was now raising its voice, and her right ankle, where she'd turned it on the route during the run to the LZ, was producing a dull warmth with every step that she recognized as mild inflammation asking to be taken seriously. She noted it, filed it, kept moving. The radio crackled. Her TOC frequency. A voice she didn't recognize, junior, slightly breathless, reading from something. Hayes, this is Keller TOC. We have your last transmitted position. QRF is available. Earliest pickup is 45 minutes. Can you reach grid? Negative on that grid. She kept her voice low. I have pursuit elements. I'm evading west. Will update position when I'm stationary. Copy. Be advised, Major Caldwell has requested a... Tell Major Caldwell I'm a little busy right now, she said, and clicked off. She almost felt bad about it. Almost. At 500 meters west of her last position, she found the thing she'd been hoping for without knowing she was hoping for it. A secondary drainage channel, dry now at the end of the wet season, cut into the terrain by years of seasonal water flow. It ran roughly northwest to southeast, which wasn't the direction she wanted but was below grade, below the surrounding jungle floor by about 1.5 meters, which meant it offered concealment from the east and south without requiring her to move through standing vegetation. She dropped into it. The footing was rocky and uneven, the kind of surface that made her ankle protest loudly enough that she couldn't file it away anymore. But the concealment was worth it. She moved along the channel at a crouching run, keeping below the lip, using the dry watercourse. The way it had been made to be used, letting the terrain work for her instead of against her. 200 meters along the drainage, she stopped. She heard the eastern flanking element pass north of her position. They'd missed her entry into the channel. The rocky floor left no trackable footprints in the way soft soil would have. She crouched against the channel wall and listened to them move past, their sound Doppler shifting from approaching to receding, and she held completely still for 30 seconds after they'd passed before she moved again. The drainage channel bent north. She followed it. At the channel's northern terminus, where it had been cut off by a rock shelf that dropped into a natural sump, she climbed out, oriented herself on the compass, and found herself 200 meters west and north of her original position, with the search element sound now behind and to the southeast. She'd threaded the gap. She sat for 30 seconds against the base of a rock face and let herself feel how tired she was. Not dramatically, not the collapse against the wall kind of tired that happened in the films she'd watched growing up, where the protagonist allowed themselves a moment of visible suffering before finding a second wind. Just a quiet inventory. Legs, functional but demanding. Back, arguing. Lungs, managing. Hands, steady. Hands still steady. She found that detail worth noting. After 53 hours in the jungle, a 6-minute multi-position engagement, a sprint through the ashfang, and an evade against a 25-man pursuit element, her hands were still steady. She stood up, found her bearing, began moving northeast toward the river, recalculating the route now that the western loop had added distance to her extraction path. The jungle dripped around her. Somewhere behind her, 25 men were searching for a ghost they couldn't find, looking for a woman they'd never been told to expect, trying to understand what had happened to their carefully constructed ambush and the 40 men they'd positioned to execute it. She thought about Caldwell again. Not with anger. Anger was expensive and she couldn't afford it right now. She thought about him the way she thought about all the problems she encountered that had no immediate solution, clinically, filed for later, the information stored but not processed. There would be a time for processing it. First, she had to get out of this jungle. She checked the compass, corrected her bearing 3 degrees east, kept moving. The darkness of the ashfang swallowed her completely, and she moved through it the way she'd been moving through difficult terrain her entire life, without permission, without acknowledgement, without anyone watching. She'd never needed anyone watching. That had always been the point. She found the river at 01 Ward 4, not dramatically. No breaking through the tree line into moonlight, no moment of relief framed against open water. The ashfang didn't offer that. What she found was the ground softening beneath her boots, the vegetation changing character from the dense ironwood understory to something lower and more water-tolerant, and then the sound of moving water underneath the ambient jungle noise. And then the river itself, 8 meters wide, dark, moving at a moderate current over a rocky bed that she could hear but not fully see through the no-Ds. She stopped at the bank and crouched, listened. The pursuit element behind her had dropped off the audible spectrum 20 minutes ago. Either they'd lost her trail when she went into the drainage channel, or they'd decided the darkness made the search too costly and had pulled back to regroup. She didn't trust either explanation enough to move without checking. She spent 2 minutes completely still, running a full audio scan of the jungle on all sides, cataloging sounds into categories: natural, neutral, threat. Nothing registered as threat. She moved to the water's edge. The river was cold. She felt it through her boots when she stepped in to test the footing. Rocky bottom, uneven, the current pushing at her ankles hard enough to be a factor. She waded into her knees and felt the temperature climb up her legs, and the water's weight lean against her from the east, and she adjusted her balance and started moving south along the bank, keeping to the shallows, using the water to break her trail. 4 kilometers south, based on her map, there was a village, or what had been a village before the conflict had reorganized the civilian population. Whether it was currently occupied and by whom was a question she couldn't answer from here. 3 kilometers south of that was the valley floor where resupply birds operated, 7 kilometers total. Her ankle told her that 7 kilometers in river shallows over rocky terrain was going to be a different conversation than 7 kilometers on solid ground. She started walking. At 0223, she reached a position she recognized from the aerial photographs in her mission brief, a wide bend in the river where the bank flattened into a gravel bar approximately 30 meters across before the jungle closed in again. She'd marked it on her map board as a potential emergency extraction point during her initial planning, which meant it was also on the mission brief that had been distributed to the Joint Operations Center, which meant Keller TOC knew about it. She climbed out of the river onto the gravel bar, pulled off her right boot, and looked at her ankle in the green wash of the no-Ds. Swollen. Not dramatically. She'd seen bad ankle sprains, and this wasn't one. But the joint was thick and warm in a way it hadn't been at the start of the night. She flexed it. Functional. It would hold. She pulled the boot back on and laced it tighter than usual, which wasn't comfortable but would give the joint the external support it needed to remain functional for the next few hours. Then she got on the radio. Keller TOC, this is Hayes. I'm at the emergency extraction point, grid November Kilo 483, requesting pickup. The response came in 40 seconds. The same young voice from earlier. Copy Hayes, be advised, extraction request has to be cleared through Major Caldwell. He's been asking about your status. She looked at the gravel bar, at the river, at the jungle on all sides, which was quiet but not empty. She'd been in the Ashfang long enough to know the difference between empty and quiet, and this stretch of river was the latter. When can I expect clearance? He's in the JOC. I can patch you through. Do it. A click. A pause. Then a sound she recognized. The specific background noise of an operations center, the hum of electronics, and the murmur of multiple simultaneous conversations, and the artificial cold of air conditioning that operations centers always kept too low because it kept people alert. Then Caldwell. Hayes. Sir. Where are you? Emergency extraction point, grid November Kilo 483. I need a pickup. I have a pursuit element somewhere behind me and my ankle is compromised. A pause. I'm going to need you to walk me through what happened tonight. She felt something tighten in her chest. Not surprise, she'd been expecting this since she'd climbed down from the tree, the specific accounting that happened after someone broke their orders and things either went well or badly. They'd gone well, but that didn't make the accounting optional. With respect, sir, I'd rather do that when I'm not sitting on a gravel bar in the Ashfang with a partial magazine and a pursuit element I haven't confirmed has stood down. I understand that. I'm asking anyway. She exhaled slowly, looked at the river. I engaged enemy positions that were about to kill 12 Navy SEALs. Then I engaged a secondary ambush element at the extraction LZ that was going to kill them again. Then I evaded a pursuit element and walked to this position. Silence. You disobeyed a direct order. Yes, sir. You engaged without authority on a frequency you weren't supposed to have. Yes, sir. You're aware that I could... Sir? She kept her voice even. Are you going to send a bird or not? The operations center background noise filled the silence. Someone in the room said something she couldn't make out. Another voice responded. Then Caldwell, quieter than before. Bird is 30 minutes out. Stay at that grid. The line clicked off. She sat on the gravel bar in the dark and listened to the river for 30 minutes. The helicopter that came for her was a Black Hawk, with no markings she could read in the dark, crewed by two pilots who said nothing to her when she climbed in and nothing to her during the 40-minute flight to Firebase Keller. She sat against the cabin wall with the Barrett across her knees and watched the Ashfang pass beneath her, a vast, lightless mass that swallowed everything that went into it and gave nothing back except, tonight, one person it probably hadn't expected to lose. She landed at Keller at 0347. The airfield was lit and active in the way forward operating bases were always active at 0347. Not busy, not quiet, the specific middle register hum of a place that never fully stopped. She climbed out of the Bird, and a specialist she'd never seen before met her at the pad with a look that suggested he'd been told to escort her somewhere and was uncomfortable about it. Staff Sergeant Hayes, that's me? Major Caldwell wants to see you in the JOC. I know. She slung the Barrett. Where's the medical station? He blinked. Ma'am? The medical station, the place where they treat injuries. Where is it? It's south side of the compound, but Major Caldwell said, tell Major Caldwell I'll be there in 20 minutes. She started walking south. Or tell him I fell down. Either way. The medic on duty at the aid station was a sergeant named Pollard, who had the look of someone 3 hours into a 12-hour shift and managing it through coffee and professional obligation. He looked at her ankle, looked at the rest of her, and said, how long have you been in the field? 55 hours, roughly. He looked at her again. The way people looked at her when they were recalibrating what they thought a person could look like after 55 hours in the Ashfang. She knew she was a mess. The ghillie suit shed on everything it touched. Her face was probably still striped with cam paint, and she'd been in and out of a river for 2 hours, which had redistributed the jungle's considerable inventory of debris across her entire kit. Sit down, he said. It's just the ankle. Sit down anyway. She sat. He wrapped the ankle with the efficient, slightly bored competence of someone who'd done it hundreds of times, asked her the standard questions, pain scale, range of motion, any numbness, and told her it was a grade 1 sprain, manageable with support and rest, and that she should avoid running on it for 48 hours. She didn't tell him about the running she'd already done on it. She thanked him, laced her boot back on over the wrap, and walked to the JOC. The Joint Operations Center at Firebase Keller was a large prefabricated structure with reinforced walls and a ceiling strung with cables and screens and the accumulated equipment of a facility that had been built for short-term use and then occupied indefinitely. At 0412 in the morning, it had a skeleton crew, watch officers, analysts, the communications specialists who ran the night cycle. And in the center of the room, at the primary planning table, Major Dennis Caldwell was standing with a tablet in his hand and an expression that she couldn't fully read from the door. She walked in. He looked at her for a moment without speaking, long enough that two of the watch officers both found reasons to look at their screens. Close the door, he said. She did. Sit down. She didn't. I've been sitting in a helicopter for 40 minutes, sir. I'm fine standing. He set the tablet down, looked at her with an expression that had moved past the readable range of what she usually saw on senior officers' faces. Not anger exactly, not the cold fury she'd expected. Something more complicated. SEAL Team 7 transmitted a full after-action report from their Bird, he said. I've read it. She waited. 12 operators. 2 wounded, both walking. Successfully extracted from a compromised LZ. He paused. The report credits you with neutralizing the primary ambush element, the secondary LZ element, and enabling the extraction under active contact. He paused again. Lieutenant Commander Cole, Sub 7 Actual, described your target acquisition speed and sequence as, he looked at the tablet, the most effective one-person suppression engagement I have witnessed in 16 years of special operations. The room was very quiet. Sir, I'm not finished. I wasn't angry. That was the thing she couldn't quite process. She'd walked in here braced for anger, for the specific institutional fury of a senior officer whose authority had been circumvented and whose judgment had been proven wrong in the same action, and what she was encountering instead was something she had less experience with. I told you to stand down. I told you your intelligence was exaggerated. I told you to leave the fighting to the SEALs. He looked at her directly. Every single thing I told you was wrong. She said nothing. That's not something I say easily, he continued. And it's not something that changes the fact that you disobeyed a direct order and used a communications frequency you had no authorization to access. Those are real violations, and they're going to have to be addressed through the appropriate process. He picked up the tablet again. But before that process happens, I need to understand something. Sir? How did you build that intercept capability? He turned the tablet toward her. On the screen was a photograph. Her intercept kit, which she'd left in the tree when she'd climbed down, and which someone had apparently retrieved. Because our signals intelligence cell looked at it, and the cell chief said, and I'm quoting, "This isn't possible with the components she would have had access to." She looked at the photograph. The kit was compact, a modified receiver, a directional antenna she'd built from materials she'd sourced across 3 deployments, a frequency scanner she'd rebuilt from the housing of a standard-issue radio, and components she'd ordered individually through channels that were technically within regulations if you didn't look at them too closely. It's possible, she said. It just takes time. Where did you learn to build that? She thought about that question for a moment, about how much of the answer was relevant to this conversation and how much of it belonged somewhere else, in a part of her history that she'd never discussed in any operational context. My father competed in radio direction finding, she said. It's a sport. You build receivers and use them to find hidden transmitters. He taught me the electronics when I was 12. She paused. I've been modifying field equipment since my first deployment. Nobody ever asked about it before. Caldwell stared at her. Nobody asked, he repeated. No, sir. He set the tablet down, rubbed his face with one hand in a gesture that looked less like a senior officer and more like a man at the end of a long night who was trying to figure out how he'd missed something this significant. Sit down, Hayes, he said. Not an order. More like a request. She sat. He sat across from her. Walk me through the 2 days, he said. Everything you observed, everything you reported, everything that happened tonight. Start from the beginning and don't leave anything out. She walked him through it. It took 40 minutes. She was precise and thorough the way she was precise and thorough about everything. Not performing competence, just exercising it, laying out the intelligence picture she'd built over 55 hours with the same methodical clarity she'd used to build it in the first place. Caldwell didn't interrupt. He made notes on his tablet. Occasionally he asked a clarifying question, a grid, a weapon identification, a timeline confirmation, and she answered without hesitation because she'd memorized all of it. The way she memorized everything she observed, because memory was the only record she could always trust. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. The third force, he said. 25 plus that you couldn't confirm the routing on. Yes, sir. Our morning aerial is going to go over that sector in about 4 hours. If they're still in the Ashfang, we'll find them. They'll be gone by then. He looked at her. They'll know the mission failed, she said. They'll extract by the same routes they came in on. The aerial will find positions, prepared positions, supply caches maybe, but not personnel. They're good. Whoever is running that element is good. How confident are you in that assessment? Same level of confidence I had in everything else I reported to you over the past 2 days, she said. Not hostile, just precise. He absorbed that. I'm going to have to open a file on the order violations, he said. I don't have a choice about that. I know. The process could go several ways depending on how the formal review shapes up. He looked at her steadily. You understand that? Yes, sir. Is there anything you want to say about the decision to disobey? She thought about that for a moment. She thought about the PKM crew adjusting their barrel for the SEAL element's position. The radio operator she'd taken out before he could update the command post. The 2 wounded operators she'd watched being helped across the LZ clearing. No, sir, she said. I made the call. I'll stand behind it. Caldwell nodded once. Get some sleep, he said. We'll continue this in the morning. She stood, started for the door. Hayes. She stopped. The intercept kit. He held up the tablet with the photograph. The cell chief said it's the most elegant field-modified signals receiver he's seen outside of a laboratory environment. A pause. He wants to know if you'd be willing to write up the construction methodology. She looked at him, looked at the photograph. I'll think about it, she said, and walked out. She slept for 4 hours on a cot in the transient quarters, the specific total sleep of a body that has been operating past its reasonable limits and has finally been given permission to stop. No dreams she could remember, just the darkness, and then the sound of the compound coming to full morning activity and her eyes opening to a ceiling she didn't immediately recognize, and then the whole weight of the previous 56 hours settling back onto her awareness, like equipment she'd set down briefly and now had to pick up again. She lay there for 60 seconds and did her inventory. Ankle, wrapped, functional, speaking to her at low volume. Back, stiff in a way that would loosen with movement. Hands. She held them up and looked at them in the morning light coming through the transient quarters' single high window. Steady. Still steady. She got up. She was in the shower block when the compound's external speakers announced a formation, not an emergency, just the routine morning formation that forward operating bases ran to account for personnel and distribute the day's information. She ignored it. She wasn't assigned to Keller's personnel roster. She was a transient, a ghost on their books. Technically the property of a reconnaissance element that was itself technically the property of a task force that preferred not to appear in operational documents with its full name. She dressed. Ati. The mess hall was open, and she took the kind of meal she'd been denying herself for 2 days, the complete calorie version rather than the minimum sustainable version, and ate it standing because the table nearest the door was occupied by a group of infantry NCOs who looked at her the way people looked at someone who'd appeared in their space without explanation and who they weren't sure what category to put in. She didn't offer them a category. She took her tray to the door and ate and watched the compound. At 0800, a Humvee she didn't recognize pulled up to the JOC and 4 men got out. She watched them from across the compound with the same automatic cataloging attention she applied to everything. The first 2 were in standard kit, Keller personnel, probably from the staff. The third was an officer she didn't recognize, carrying a tablet, moving with the slightly accelerated pace of someone who'd been summoned rather than scheduled. The fourth man she recognized, Lieutenant Commander Ethan Cole. 7 actual. She'd never seen his face before, she'd only heard his voice on the radio. But his rank insignia and the specific way he moved through a space, the contained but absolute confidence of someone who'd spent 16 years doing the most difficult things their branch of service offered, identified him as clearly as a name tag. He stopped in the middle of the compound and looked around. She watched him scan the compound the way she scanned everything, systematically, patient, not hurried. His scan stopped on her. She didn't move. He walked toward her, alone. The other 3 had gone into the JOC. He crossed the compound with the same direct, unhurried pace he'd used getting out of the vehicle, and he stopped 2 meters from her and looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't read. "Staff Sergeant Hayes," he said. "Sir? You look exactly like I expected you to look." She wasn't sure how to take that. "Sir?" "Someone who's been in a tree for 2 days and then ran 6 kilometers through the ash fang in the dark." He paused. "You look like that." She almost smiled. Almost. "The medic says I should avoid running for 48 hours. "Good advice." He looked at her for another moment. "I wanted to come find you before the formal stuff started, before it gets complicated." "Sir? I have 12 operators who are alive this morning who would not be alive if you'd followed your orders." He said it without inflection, not dramatically, not as a compliment exactly, just as a statement of fact in the same register you'd use to describe weather or terrain. "I've been doing this a long time. I've seen good work. What you did last night in that ravine and at that LZ was not good work. It was something else." She didn't say anything. "Your target sequencing," he continued. "PKM first, then the command element. You took out the radio operator before he could update the command post. Then you started on the flanking force before they could maneuver." He shook his head slightly. "You'd been watching those positions for 2 days and you had the entire engagement pre-planned. Every shot had a priority and a purpose." "Standard targeting doctrine," she said, "not at the speed you ran it." She looked at him. He was watching her with the specific attention of someone who was trying to solve a problem they found genuinely interesting. "What's your background?" he asked. "Before the Army. South Dakota. My father was a shooter." "What kind?" "Competitive. Precision rifle. He also did radio direction finding." She paused. And he hunted. Everything. Anything in season. Cole nodded slowly. What made you come down from that tree? The question caught her off balance. Not because she didn't have an answer, she had a very clear answer, but because no one had asked it. Not Caldwell, not the TOC, not the medic. Everyone had asked what she'd done and why she'd violated her orders and what her intercept capability was built from. Nobody had asked about the moment. I watched the PKM crew adjust their barrel, she said. They were fine-tuning the angle for the engagement range. They'd calculated it ahead of time. They knew the SEAL element's approach route. They knew the entry point into the ravine. They'd worked out the geometry. They were ready. She paused. You don't set up that kind of ambush and then use it wrong. They were going to hit your element from the moment the lead operator rounded that second bend. All 12 of them, in a box with no functional cover and no exit. She looked at him directly. And I was in a position to stop it. Cole was quiet for a moment. Your command told you not to. Yes, sir. And you decided your assessment was more reliable than your commands. I decided my position was more reliable than my commands, she said. I was 60 feet above the kill zone with 2 days of observation. Major Caldwell was 40 kilometers away with no assets in that sector. The positions weren't the same. He looked at her for a long moment. That's going to be an interesting argument at your review board. Yes, sir. I'll be there, he said, for whatever that's worth. She looked at him. It's worth something, she said. He nodded, looked toward the JOC. Caldwell's going to want us both in there in about 20 minutes, the formal debrief. He turned back to her. You ready for that? She thought about Caldwell's face last night when he'd read Cole's after-action report. The complicated expression she hadn't been able to fully categorize. She thought about the watch officers who'd found reasons to look at their screens. I've been ready for that conversation since hour 22, she said. Cole looked at her for a moment, and something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile, but close. The specific expression of someone who'd heard an answer they weren't expecting and found it suited them. All right, he said. Let's go. They walked toward the JOC together across the compound, and she was aware for the first time since she'd climbed down from that ironwood tree, of the way the other people in the compound were watching. Not staring, they were military. They were trained not to stare, but noticing. The transient woman covered in cam paint residue and river debris walking alongside the SEAL commander like she belonged there. She didn't particularly care about being noticed. What she cared about was what was waiting inside the JOC and what it was going to cost her, and whether she was going to be able to keep doing the work she was good at when it was done. She pushed the door open. The room went quiet in the specific way rooms went quiet when something significant walked in. At the primary planning table, Caldwell was standing with 2 officers she didn't recognize, and a man in civilian clothes who had the specific quality of stillness that intelligence officers cultivated. On the screen behind them was a composite map of the Ashfang, her grid overlays, her enemy position markers, the SEAL element's movement route, the LZ, all of it plotted in color on a terrain base that made the previous night's geometry suddenly, starkly visible. Caldwell looked at her, then at Cole, then back at the map. Let's start from the beginning, he said. And then the second door opened. She heard it behind her, the JOC's secondary entrance, which accessed the communications wing. And she turned, and the man standing in the doorway was someone she recognized from a photograph she'd been shown at a mission brief 8 months earlier. A photograph she'd been told was need to know only, and she'd been told she needed to know because she was being assigned to a recon element operating in a sector adjacent to his area of interest. A general officer, 2 stars. And behind him, 2 aides who were both watching her with expressions she couldn't read at this distance. He looked at the room, at Cole, at Caldwell, then at her. Which one is Hayes? He said. Caldwell said nothing. Cole said, She is, sir. The general walked into the room and the 2 aides followed and the door closed behind them, and Rachel Hayes stood in the middle of the Joint Operations Center at Firebase Keller and felt the specific weight of a situation that had just expanded far beyond the boundaries she'd been managing since hour 22. She kept her hands at her sides. Steady. They were always steady. The general stopped 3 feet from her and looked at her for a long moment in the same way men in positions of significant authority looked at things they were trying to understand quickly. I read Cole's report on the flight in, he said. All of it. He paused. Caldwell. Sir, Caldwell said. Close the door. All of them. Caldwell moved. The general looked at Rachel. "Start talking," he said. She started talking. Not the way she'd talked to Caldwell the night before. That had been a debrief, linear and methodical, one event following the next in chronological order. This was different. The general, 2 stars, name tape reading Voas, the kind of stillness that came from decades of having rooms go quiet when he walked into them, listened differently than Caldwell listened. He didn't take notes. He didn't look at the map behind her. He looked at her face, and she understood quickly that he was reading her the way she read terrain, looking for the thing the surface didn't show. She gave him the same account she'd given Caldwell, with 2 differences. She went faster because he was tracking at a level that didn't need her to explain the connections between pieces. And she didn't soften anything, because she had the distinct impression that Voss had dealt with enough softened accounts in his career to recognize the texture of one immediately, and that recognizing it would cost her more than the uncut version. When she finished, the room was quiet. Voss hadn't moved. He was standing the same way he'd stood when he walked in, weight balanced, arms loose, the posture of someone who'd spent years in environments where stillness was a professional asset. "The intercept capability," he said. "Walk me through it." "Modified receiver, directional antenna I built from components sourced across 3 deployments. The frequency scanner is a rebuild. I used the housing from a standard issue PRC 152 and replaced the internal architecture." "Where did the replacement components come from?" "Commercial suppliers. Nothing restricted. The individual parts are legal. It's the assembly that's—" She paused. "Irregular." "Irregular," Voss repeated. "That's one word for it." He glanced at the man in civilian clothes who was seated at the far end of the planning table and who had not spoken or changed expression since the general entered the room. Something passed between them. Not a gesture, just a shared look that carried information she wasn't party to. "How long did it take you to build?" "The first version took about 8 months. I've modified it 4 times since. The current version took approximately 2 months of work distributed across downtime periods. 8 months to build a field-expedient SIGINT capability from commercial parts that your own reconnaissance element doesn't have." He said it evenly, not as a compliment, not as an accusation, just as a fact he was placing in a specific mental folder. "What made you think you needed it?" She considered the question. It was the kind of question that had more than one honest answer, and the honest answers were arranged in a hierarchy she needed to sort quickly. "On my second deployment," she said, "we lost a 2-man element because we didn't know a position had been reinforced. The signals traffic that would have told us was on a frequency we weren't monitoring. They were ambushed at 300 meters and never had a chance to break contact." She looked at him steadily. "I decided I wasn't going to be in a situation where I was missing information that existed and was accessible, so I built something that could access it." Voss looked at her for a long moment. "The 2 men you lost," he said. "What were their names?" She told him, both of them, first and last. He nodded once, not performing respect, just acknowledging it. Then he turned to Caldwell, and the temperature in the room changed. "Major." Caldwell straightened. He'd been standing slightly back from the primary group, and he came forward now with the posture of someone who'd been waiting for a door to open and wasn't sure whether what was behind it was good or bad. "Sir, you received 2 separate intelligence reports from Sergeant Hayes over a period of 14 hours. Both reports identified a prepared enemy ambush element at specific grid coordinates with specific weapons identification and specific disposition of force." Voss's voice was unchanged. Same register, same pace, which somehow made it worse. "You assessed both reports as exaggerated." "Sir, at the time, the available corroborating intelligence—" "I've read the available corroborating intelligence." Voss held up a hand. Not a silencing gesture, a stopping one. There was a difference. The absence of aerial confirmation in that sector was a function of the storm system that grounded our ISR assets for 18 hours, which you knew. The absence of SIGINT confirmation was because our SIGINT capability in that corridor is a 17-year-old system that can't cover the frequency range Hayes was monitoring, which you also knew. He paused. What you had was a trained reconnaissance asset, 2 days in the objective area, reporting a prepared enemy force in detail. What you did with that was dismiss it and call her a— He looked at the tablet Caldwell was holding. "Recon girl." The room was very quiet. Caldwell's jaw tightened. Sir, the characterization was, "It's in the radio log, Major. You set it on a recorded frequency." Voss set the tablet down on the planning table. "I'm not here to adjudicate your personnel management choices. I'm here because 12 Navy SEALs almost died in an ambush that one Army staff sergeant had been reporting for 2 days, and then didn't die because that same staff sergeant disobeyed your direct order." He looked at Caldwell directly. "So before we talk about Sergeant Hayes's order violations, I need you to help me understand what you thought you were doing." The silence stretched. It wasn't the silence of a room full of people who had nothing to say. It was the silence of a room full of people who had various things to say and were all making rapid calculations about what saying them would cost. Caldwell made his calculation. "I assess the report as exceeding the probable enemy capability in that sector," he said. "Based on our previous intelligence picture, a 40-man force with crew-served weapons in prepared positions was inconsistent with what we knew about enemy strength in the Ashfang corridor." "Based on an intelligence picture that was 3 weeks old," the man in civilian clothes said. Everyone looked at him. He'd spoken without moving, without changing his posture, the words delivered with the flat precision of someone who'd been waiting for the right sentence to attach them to. "The last comprehensive update on enemy disposition in the Ashfang corridor was 22 days before Hayes's first report," he continued. "In the intervening period, our assessments reflect 2 confirmed enemy resupply movements through that sector and 1 probable command node relocation. The picture Major Caldwell was working from was outdated. That's an intelligence failure that predates his decision to dismiss Hayes's reports, and it's one that belongs to my office as much as his." He paused. "I want that in the record." Voss looked at him. "Noted, Carver. So that was who the civilian was." Rachel filed the name. "Sergeant Hayes." Voss turned back to her. "The order violations. You understand I can't simply set those aside." "Yes, sir." "The unauthorized frequency access is the more serious issue from a legal standpoint. The engagement without authority is more serious from an operational standpoint." He picked up the tablet again, looked at it. "Your reconnaissance element's legal officer is going to open a file. That process will run its course. What I can tell you is that the outcome of that process is not predetermined, and that Cole's report and whatever comes out of this debrief will be part of the evidentiary record." He set the tablet down. "Do you understand what I'm telling you? That the review board isn't a formality." "Correct." "And that the outcome depends on what goes into the record." "Also correct." She looked at him. "Sir, I want to say something for the record right now." "Go ahead." "I knew when I climbed down from that tree that I was going to face this conversation. I knew what the violations were, and I knew what the process looked like, and I went ahead anyway." She kept her voice even. "I'm not going to stand here and tell you that I agonized over the decision, because I didn't. I looked at what was in front of me and I made a call. If the review board decides that call was wrong, then I'll accept whatever the board determines." She paused. "But I'd make the same call again. With the same information, in the same position, I'd make the same call." The room was quiet. Cole, standing to her left, said nothing, but she saw him, in her peripheral vision, nod once. Small, barely perceptible. Voss looked at her for a long time. "All right," he said finally. He turned to Caldwell. "Major, you're going to submit a full written account of your decision process on both of Hayes's reports. Timeline, reasoning, what you weighed, and why. I want it by 1800 today." Caldwell's expression shifted. "Sir, that account will be part of the legal record." "Yes, it will." A pause. "Sir." "Dismissed, both of you." He gestured toward the 2 unfamiliar officers. They filed out. Then he looked at Caldwell. "That includes you, Major." Caldwell looked at Rachel once. She couldn't read what was in it. Too many things competing for the surface. Then he walked out and closed the door, and it was Voss and Cole and Carver and Rachel in the JOC. Voss pulled out a chair and sat down. The change in his posture was subtle but real. From the standing version of himself, which was formal and final, to the sitting version, which was still authoritative but different, more direct. "Carver," he said, "tell her." The intelligence officer uncrossed his legs and leaned forward. "The force you identified in the Ashfang," he said, "isn't the standard local militia element we've been tracking in that sector. We think it's connected to a command network that's been operating in 3 separate countries over the past 18 months. The Ashfang position was..." He paused, choosing his words, more significant than a standard ambush element. The SEAL team was the target, but not the primary target. They were bait. She looked at him. Bait for what? For the response. Specifically for the QRF and command assets that would have been committed to an extraction operation after 12 SEALs went into a kill zone. He paused. The third force you identified, the 25-plus element you evaded, wasn't a pursuit element. It was positioned to hit the QRF helicopters at the LZ when they came in to extract the casualties. She sat with that for a moment. They were going to let the primary ambush happen, she said slowly, and then hit the rescue response. It's a layered operation, sophisticated, the kind of planning that takes weeks and requires real-time intelligence on our operational patterns. Carver leaned back. When you disrupted the primary ambush, the third force lost its trigger. No casualties in the ravine meant no QRF response, meant no second engagement. The whole operation collapsed. She thought about the radio traffic she'd intercepted. The word she'd understood as intercept. That's what the third element's grid was for, she said. Not me. They weren't trying to intercept me. They were positioning for the QRF corridor. Correct. You were, from their perspective, an unknown variable that shouldn't have existed. Carver looked at her steadily. Which is why we need to talk about your intercept kit. Voss said, the signals traffic you pulled from their command net. How much of it did you capture? I have logs, she said. Everything I recorded is in the spotter notebook and on the receiver's storage card. She reached into her rig's cargo pocket. She was still wearing the rig, hadn't been given a reason to take it off, and pulled out the notebook, set it on the table. Carver reached for it. Wait, Voss said. Carver stopped. Voss looked at Rachel. The storage card. Where is it? Still in the kit. In the tree. A brief silence. You left it in the tree, Voss said. I had to climb down fast. The kit weighs 4 kilograms and I was running to the LZ. I took the rifle and the ammunition and left the support equipment. She paused. Someone retrieved the kit. Caldwell had a photograph of it last night. Voss looked at Carver. Is the card in the kit? Carver pulled out his own tablet, typed something, waited, read. Yes, he said. The retrieval team brought everything. Card is intact. Get it processed. Already tasked. Voss looked back at Rachel. The logs in the notebook. Can you reconstruct the intercepts from memory? The ones I thought were significant, yes. The full volume of traffic, no. What did you think was significant? She went through it. The positioning transmission she'd recorded in the first 24 hours. Routine command net traffic that established the enemy element's internal communication structure. The frequency shifts she'd tracked. 3 of them over 2 days. Suggesting an operator-level OPSEC awareness that was more sophisticated than standard militia practice. The specific traffic at hour 38, the grid she'd pulled, the word she'd understood as intercept. And one other thing she hadn't transmitted, hadn't had time to transmit, and then had been moving too fast to stop and transmit, and then had been fighting and evading and hadn't processed its significance until she was on the gravel bar waiting for her extraction bird. There was a call sign, she said, used 3 times, always by the same station. I think it was the command post behind the eastern ridge. She paused. I don't know if it means anything. It might be a personal call sign, might be a unit designation. But it was used 3 times across 14 hours of traffic, always in what sounded like a reporting context, someone calling up to a higher element. The same call sign, the same station, the same higher. Carver was very still. What was it? She told him. He looked at Voss. Voss looked at her. Say that again, Carver said. She said it again. Carver typed something on his tablet rapidly. Waited. Read. His expression didn't change as an intelligence officer's expressions rarely changed, but something in his posture shifted. The specific controlled shift of someone who just received information that mattered more than they'd expected. Sir? He said to Voss. I see it, Voss said. He was reading over Carver's shoulder. What is it? Cole asked. He'd been quiet since the room cleared, standing against the wall with his arms folded, the posture of someone who was present and tracking but had deliberately positioned himself as a witness rather than a participant. It's a call sign we've been looking for 14 months, Voss said. He straightened, looked at Rachel. 14 months across 3 operational theaters and 9 separate collection efforts. And you pulled it from a field-built receiver in the Ashfang jungle. She didn't say anything. The review board, Voss said. I told you the outcome wasn't predetermined. That's still true. But I want you to understand something. He looked at her directly. What's in that notebook and on that storage card may be more operationally significant than the 12 operators Cole brought home last night. Both matter. But the intelligence picture you built, independently, with equipment you constructed yourself, without authorization or support, is going to have consequences that extend well past this firebase. She looked at the notebook on the table. At the spotter's log she'd filled in the dark in a tree 60 feet above a jungle that had been trying to kill everyone in it. What happens now? She asked. Now the process runs, Voss said. The review board, the violations, all of it. That doesn't go away. I won't pretend it does. He paused. But process and outcome are different things. You'll have representation. Cole will submit his report as formal testimony. My office will submit the operational assessment of your intelligence collection. He looked at her steadily. And I'll submit my own statement, for whatever weight it carries. She absorbed that. Sir, can I ask you something? Go ahead. Caldwell. What happens to him? Voss looked at her for a moment. The question had a shape to it that she knew he recognized. Not vindictive, not the question of someone who wanted to watch someone else go down, but the question of someone who needed to understand whether the institution she'd been serving had a mechanism for addressing its own failures. That depends on what his written account says, Voss said, and on what the radio logs show, and on whether the investigation that follows this debrief finds other instances of reports being dismissed by that office. He paused. It's a separate process from yours, but it's a real one. She nodded. One more thing, Cole said from the wall. Everyone looked at him. Seven asked me to submit a formal request this morning. He unfolded his arms. Before I flew over here. He looked at Rachel. SEAL Team 7 is formally requesting Staff Sergeant Hayes as a permanent attached asset. The request goes through the Joint Task Force, so it needs Voss's office to sign off. He paused. Sir. Voss looked at Cole, then at Rachel, then at Carver. That's an unusual request, he said. 7 is an unusual team, Cole said. The corner of Voss's mouth moved. Not quite a smile, close enough that it registered. I'll take it under advisement. He stood. Hayes, get something to eat. Get some more sleep. The formal review starts at 1400, and it's going to run long. He picked up the notebook from the table and handed it to Carver. And someone get this woman a new set of fatigues. She looks like she crawled out of the jungle. I did crawl out of the jungle, Rachel said. I know, Voss said. That's why it's a statement, not a criticism. He walked toward the primary exit. Cole. With me. Cole passed Rachel on his way to the door. He stopped for exactly 1 second, not long enough to be a conversation, long enough to be deliberate. 14 months, he said quietly. That call sign. 14 months. She looked at him. You didn't know, he said. You pulled it because you pull everything, because that's what you do. She didn't answer. He walked out. What? Carver stayed behind. He waited until the door closed, and then he sat in the chair across from her at the planning table, and he put his tablet face down on the surface, and he looked at her with the specific attention of someone who'd been waiting to have a direct conversation since he'd walked into the room. The review board, he said. It's going to be uncomfortable. I expect so. The unauthorized frequency access carries a specific charge under the UCMJ. Caldwell's legal officer isn't going to have a choice about whether to pursue it. He's going to have to pursue it, and the severity of the finding is going to depend significantly on how the board weighs the operational context. She looked at him. You're telling me this because my office is going to be part of the operational context submission, and because I want you to understand something before we write that submission. He leaned forward slightly. The receiver you built, the collection methodology, the log structure in that notebook. He paused. That's not improvised work. That's systematic. Someone with a background in competitive radio direction finding and 3 deployments of field experience built something that my office has been trying to develop through official channels for 2 years. He paused again. With considerably more resources than you had access to. She looked at him steadily. What are you actually saying? I'm saying that the way this situation gets characterized, in my submission to the review board, in the operational assessment that goes up the chain, has more than one accurate version, and that the version I write is going to reflect what I actually think happened. He picked up his tablet, which is that a trained asset identified a threat that the official intelligence architecture missed, built a collection capability that the official SIGINT apparatus couldn't match, and made a call in the field that saved 12 lives and produced operationally significant intelligence that 14 months of institutional effort failed to generate. He looked at her. That's the accurate version. It also happens to be the version that reflects best on Sergeant Hayes. She looked at him for a long moment. "You're not doing this for me," she said. "No," he said. "I'm doing it because it's accurate, and because the call sign you pulled has names attached to it that my office very much wants to find, and the process of finding them is going to go faster and better if the asset who pulled it is intact and operational, rather than administratively processed out of the service." He stood. "Those interests happen to align with yours. I'm not going to pretend otherwise." She appreciated the honesty. It was the kind of honesty she could work with. "The third force," she said. "The 25-plus element. They're going to pull back. I told Caldwell they'd be gone before morning aerial." "You were right. Aerial at 0630 found prepared positions and 3 supply cache sites, no personnel." "The cache sites, did you recover them?" "2 of 3. The third was booby-trapped. We lost a disposal robot." He paused. "Not personnel. The robot." "The 2 you recovered. Anything useful?" Carver looked at her with the expression of someone who was recalibrating how they'd expected this conversation to go. "Medical supplies," he said. "Commercial grade, which is consistent with a force that's operating outside normal military logistics. Some communications equipment, hardware, we haven't seen in this region before." He paused. "And a document. Handwritten. We're working on the translation." "What language?" He told her. She thought for a moment. "My Pashto is basic, but I have a passable reading comprehension in—" She paused, named the related dialect. Carver stared at her. "You read—" "Basic comprehension, not fluent." She paused. "I taught myself on the second deployment. There was a lot of downtime." Carver sat back down. He pulled up a photograph on his tablet, turned it toward her. A handwritten page, photographed, the script running right to left across lined paper. She looked at it. "Give me a minute," she said. He gave her the minute. She read slowly, parsing the characters with the specific effort of someone working in a language they'd learned without a teacher, relying on pattern recognition and the vocabulary she'd built from a purchased textbook and a dictionary that had fallen apart at the spine by the end of her second deployment. "It's a movement order," she said, "or part of one. There's a section missing. I think this is the middle of a longer document." She traced the lines with her finger without touching the screen. "This part is a grid reference. This part is a time. This—" She paused. "This word I don't know. But the context is, it's a type of asset, something that arrives, something that has to be received." Carver was typing. "This section," she continued, "is an authentication protocol, a challenge response structure, and this—" She stopped. "What?" "This is a name." She looked at him. "Or a call sign, the same one I pulled from the radio traffic." Carver stopped typing. "Same one," she said. "In a written document found in a cache site in the Ashfang. Same call sign." He looked at the screen for a long moment. Then he picked up his phone and made a call. She sat at the planning table in the JOC at Firebase Keller and listened to Carver talk to someone she couldn't identify about something she was only partially cleared to know, and she looked at the composite map on the screen behind the planning table. Her grid overlays, her enemy position markers, all the patient work of 55 hours alone in a tree rendered in color on a terrain base. And she thought about the 2 men she'd lost on her second deployment. Their names. She'd given them to a 2-star general at 0412 in the morning, and he'd nodded once, and she'd understood that he'd filed them the same way she had. Not forgotten, not performed, just held. The specific weight of names that meant something and always would. The JOC hummed around her. Someone on the far side of the room was running a radio check. The screens updated. The compound outside was fully awake now, the sounds of a working firebase coming through the walls. At 1400, the review board would convene. She had 3 hours. She sat at the table and looked at the map and thought about what came next. Not with dread, not with the specific anxiety of someone facing an institutional process that could end their career. More with the focused attention she brought to any problem that required preparation. She thought about the call sign she'd pulled from a frequency she wasn't supposed to be monitoring with equipment she wasn't supposed to have. 14 months. She thought about a tree 60 feet high in the Ashfang jungle and the view from it, the patient, total view of someone who'd been there long enough to see everything. She thought about what Caldwell had said to her. Leave the fighting to people whose job it is to fight. She looked at her hands on the planning table. Steady. She started preparing for the review board. The review board convened at 1400 in a room that had been a storage facility 6 months earlier and still smelled faintly of cardboard and packing material underneath the institutional cleaning product someone had applied to the floor. 3 officers at a folding table, a recorder in the corner with a laptop. Rachel on one side of the table, her appointed legal representative, a captain named Doss who'd been practicing military law for 4 years and had reviewed her case file in the 2 hours between his assignment and the convening. On the other side of a legal pad covered in notes, he kept referencing with the slightly pressured attention of someone who'd been given more material than time. The board ran for 3 hours and 20 minutes. She answered every question directly, without qualification, without the softening language that Doss had suggested in their brief pre-board preparation, and that she'd declined to adopt because it had the specific texture of someone who wasn't sure they were right. She was sure. She answered from that place. The unauthorized frequency access. Confirmed, explained. The technical methodology laid out in the same details she'd given Voss and Carver. The engagement without authority. Confirmed, justified on the grounds of immediate threat to life and the specific geometry of her position relative to both the threat and the command authority that had failed to act on available intelligence. The construction of the intercept kit over 3 deployments. Confirmed, with a detailed account of each component, each modification, each field test. The board asked her twice, in 2 different formulations, whether she would make the same decisions again with the same information. Twice she said yes. Doss winced slightly both times. She didn't change her answer. At 16:20, the board recessed to deliberate. She sat in the hallway outside on a folding chair, and Doss sat next to her and looked at his legal pad and said, "The yes answers to the hypothetical are going to complicate the mitigation argument. I know. It makes it harder to frame the violations as situational rather than dispositional. I know. Dispositional violations carry heavier findings. I know, Captain." She looked at him. He was young for his rank, early 30s probably, with the slightly exhausted look of someone who'd been working in a system that generated more problems than it solved. "I appreciate what you're trying to do. I'm not going to tell them I'd make a different call, because I wouldn't." He looked at his legal pad. "I know," he said, which was different from the 3 times she'd said it, because his had a resignation in it that hers didn't. They sat in the hallway for 40 minutes. At 1700, the door opened. The senior board member, a lieutenant colonel named Marsh, who'd run the proceeding with the methodical competence of someone who'd done it many times and found no satisfaction in it, read the finding in the same flat register he'd used to ask questions for 3.5 hours. The board found that Staff Sergeant Rachel Hayes had committed 2 violations: unauthorized use of a restricted communications frequency and engagement of enemy forces without command authority. Both findings were entered into the record as confirmed. Then Marsh looked up from the paper. The board also finds, by unanimous determination, that both violations occurred in the context of an immediate and credible threat to the lives of 12 United States military personnel, that the violations directly resulted in the preservation of those lives, and that the preceding command decisions, specifically the repeated dismissal of Sergeant Hayes's intelligence reports, constituted a contributing factor that materially constrained the options available to her. He paused. In accordance with those findings, and with reference to the supplementary operational assessments submitted by Lieutenant Commander Cole's office and General Voss's command, the board recommends a formal letter of reprimand to be placed in Sergeant Hayes's service record, with a concurrent recommendation that the reprimand be reviewed for expungement after a period of 12 months contingent on continued service. He set the paper down. "That's the finding," he said. "Do you have questions?" She had a few. She asked none of them. "No, sir." "Then we're done here." She walked out of the room into the hallway, and Doss let out a breath that he'd apparently been holding since the door opened. A long and controlled exhalation that communicated more about how he'd assessed the board's likely finding than anything he'd said during their preparation. Letter of reprimand, he said. Given the violations, that's the minimum finding they could have issued. I know. And the expungement path means it doesn't have to be permanent. I know, Captain. He looked at her. You don't seem relieved. She thought about that. She was relieved. She'd understood what the range of outcomes looked like, and the bottom of that range had included consequences that would have ended her ability to do the work she was good at. Relief was the appropriate response to not being at the bottom of the range. But it was a quiet relief, the kind that didn't show on the outside. The same way most of what she felt didn't show on the outside, because showing it had never been something the job rewarded. I'm relieved, she said. I'm just not going to make a production of it. Doss looked at her for a moment and then laughed. A short, surprise sound, the kind that happened when something was funnier than the situation felt it should allow. All right, he said. Fair enough. She found Caldwell at 1745, standing outside the JOC with a tablet in his hand and the specific posture of a man who'd been waiting for something and wasn't sure it was going to go well. She hadn't gone looking for him. She'd been walking to the mess hall, and he'd been there, and she'd stopped because not stopping would have been its own kind of statement, and she'd already made all the statements she needed to make. He looked at her. How did it come out? He asked. Letter of reprimand, expungement path at 12 months. He nodded slowly. Something crossed his face that she couldn't fully categorize. Not quite relief, not quite guilt, somewhere in between. That's fair, he said, given the violations. Yes, sir. A pause. My written account went to Voss's office at 1745, he said. Everything, the reasoning, the assessments, the radio log content. He looked at the tablet. I didn't soften it. She looked at him. That was unexpected enough that she took a moment to process it. Why not? He was quiet for a moment. Because 12 people are alive and I was the reason they almost weren't. He said it without drama, without the inflection of someone performing accountability. Just a man stating a fact he'd spent the day arriving at. And because the Recon girl comment. He paused. That's in the log. There's no version of this where I don't have to look at that. He finally met her eyes directly. It was a bad call. All of it. The dismissals, the language, the order to stand down. Every piece of it was wrong. Another pause. I'm not asking you to do anything with that. I just wanted to say it to your face. She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about what she'd expected from this moment. If she was honest with herself, she'd expected something that felt more like victory. The satisfaction of being proved right in front of the person who'd been most aggressively wrong. She'd been working toward that moment in some background part of her awareness since the first radio transmission had come back dismissive. What she felt instead was something much quieter and less satisfying and more true. A man who'd made bad calls was standing in front of her saying so, and the saying so didn't undo the calls, and the calls didn't erase the saying so, and the whole thing was just the complicated, imperfect texture of people and institutions trying to function under pressure and sometimes failing and sometimes catching themselves afterward. I heard you, sir, she said. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't absolution. It was just the honest acknowledgement that the words had landed, which was what he'd asked for and what she could give. He nodded. She walked to the mess hall. She was on her second cup of coffee when Cole found her. He pulled out the chair across from her without asking and sat down and looked at her for a moment with the same direct problem-solving attention she'd come to recognize as his default setting. Board finding? He said. Letter of reprimand. 12-month expungement path. That's what Voss expected. Good guess by Voss. Cole's mouth moved in something that wasn't quite a smile. He folded his hands on the mess table. The formal request went through this afternoon, Seven's attachment request. Voss mentioned he'd take it under advisement. He signed it at 16:30. She set her coffee down. The reprimand doesn't disqualify the attachment? The reprimand documents a violation that the operational assessment frames as a product of command failure as much as individual choice. Voss's office made sure that framing was clear. He paused. It also helps that the intelligence you pulled is currently being described, by people who know what they're talking about, as a significant operational development. He looked at her directly. Carver's office has been working that call sign since 1100 this morning. She thought about the document from the cache site, the handwritten movement order with the authentication protocol and the call sign appearing in both the radio traffic and the written record. Have they found anything? Enough to confirm that whoever is using that call sign is running a network that's significantly more organized than anything we've had mapped in that region. He paused. And enough to confirm that your intercept logs are the most complete picture we have of how that network communicates. He looked at her. Carver wants to talk to you about the receiver, the construction methodology. He mentioned that. He's going to want more than a conversation. He's going to want you to build them, train people to use them. He let that land. That's separate from the 7 attachment, but it's related. She looked at the table, at her coffee, at the mess hall around her, soldiers eating, talking, the ordinary texture of a forward operating base at dinner time, the kind of normalcy that existed right next to the kind of abnormality she'd been living in for the past 57 hours. When does the attachment start? She asked. 2 weeks, pending your medical clearance. He glanced at her ankle. The sprain. Grade 1. I'll be cleared in a week. Then 2 weeks. He paused. Hayes. She looked up. I've been doing this for 16 years, he said. I have operators on my team who have been doing it for 12, 14 years. Men who've been through things that, he paused, choosing the words, most people don't survive and fewer survive intact. He looked at her steadily. What you did in that ravine, and at that LZ, and in that jungle afterward, I've seen it before. Parts of it. The target sequencing, the position discipline, the decision to climb down and move instead of waiting for extraction. He paused. But I've never seen all of it in one person, in one engagement, at the end of 51 hours without sleep in hostile terrain. He paused one more time. I wanted you to know that. She looked at him. There was a version of her that would have deflected this, would have said something about the Barrett's accuracy or the terrain advantage or the favorable shot geometry, the professional's habit of distributing credit to the tools and the conditions rather than accepting it for herself. She'd done that her whole career. It was efficient, and it kept expectations manageable, and it avoided the specific vulnerability of being seen clearly by someone who had the standing to see you. Thank you, she said instead. Cole nodded once. He stood. 0600 Monday, he said. Keller Airfield. We'll start the orientation. I'll be there. He walked out. She finished her coffee. At 1900, Voss found her. Not in the mess hall. She'd moved to the compound's eastern wall by then, a stretch of HESCO barrier that caught the last of the daylight from the west, and was usually unoccupied in the dinner hour. She was sitting on an equipment crate with her back to the barrier and her repaired ankle extended, and her eyes on the compound, doing the things she did when she had time and nothing immediate to process, watching the way people moved through a space, cataloging behavior, the involuntary observation habit of someone who'd spent years making stillness productive. Voss walked toward her alone. No aids. He stopped a meter away and looked at the compound the same direction she was looking, as if he'd come specifically to share the view. The board finding, he said. Yes, sir. Fair? She thought about it honestly. Fair enough. He nodded. Caldwell's written account went to the IG this afternoon, along with the radio logs. He paused. The investigation into his handling of your reports is going to take a few months. The outcome isn't predetermined. You told me that already, sir. About my board. I know. I'm telling you again because the outcome of his process is genuinely uncertain, and I don't want you to go into the next chapter expecting a specific result that may or may not materialize. He looked at her. Institutional accountability moves at its own pace. Sometimes it arrives where it should, sometimes it doesn't. I know that, sir. I know you know it. I'm saying it anyway because... He paused. Because you've been inside a system that failed you, and you've handled that with more discipline than most people would have. And I don't want the next few months to undo that because you're waiting for a resolution that's outside your control. She looked at him. The compound moved around them. A vehicle crossed from the motor pool to the supply depot. 2 soldiers walked past, speaking in low voices about something that had nothing to do with anything that had happened in the last 24 hours. Sir, she said, can I ask you something? Go ahead. The call sign, the network Carver's office is working. She paused. Is it going somewhere, or is it going to be analyzed and filed and referenced in a report that goes up the chain and sits in a folder somewhere? Voss looked at her for a long moment. That depends on a lot of things, he said. Some of which I control, and some of which I don't. He paused. But I'll tell you this. What you pulled from that jungle is the first solid thread we've had on this network's communications architecture. You don't pull a thread like that and file it. You follow it. He looked at her directly. And the person who pulled it is going to be in a position to help with the following, if that's a direction she's willing to go. She looked at the compound. She thought about 51 hours in an ironwood tree, about the patience required to build a picture that nobody wanted to look at, about the moment she'd pressed the first trigger and the PKM position had gone silent, and 12 men below her had had the specific experience of realizing they were going to live after all. She thought about the 2 men she'd lost on her second deployment, their names, the frequency range she hadn't been monitoring. Yes, she said. Voss nodded. He reached into his jacket pocket and took out a coin. Military challenge coin, the kind that senior officers carried and occasionally presented in lieu of more formal recognition, the currency of acknowledgement that existed outside the official record. He held it out. She looked at it. Then she took it. She turned it over in her hand. On one side, the insignia of his command. On the other, nothing. Smooth, unmarked metal. I had the back left blank, he said. I've been carrying that one for about 6 months, waiting for a situation that warranted it. He paused. I don't give them for following orders. She closed her hand around it. Get some rest, he said. Monday comes fast. He walked back across the compound and she watched him go. And the last of the day's light caught the top of the HESCO barrier above her head and turned it briefly gold before the sun dropped behind the western ridgeline, and the compound shifted into the artificial light of fluorescent fixtures and vehicle headlamps. She opened her hand and looked at the coin again, smooth on the back, unmarked. She thought about what Voss had said. I don't give them for following orders. She understood what that meant, not as a validation of the specific violations, not as an endorsement of the choice to override command authority, but as a recognition of something older and more fundamental. The willingness to act on what you know when the cost of acting is real and the cost of not acting is someone else's life. She put the coin in her cargo pocket, next to the empty space where her spotter's notebook had been before she'd put it on the planning table. She'd need a new notebook. She'd need a lot of things, starting Monday. She stood up, tested her ankle. It held, the medic's wrap doing its job, the joint complaining at a manageable register. She adjusted the Barrett sling, looked at the compound one more time with the involuntary cataloging attention she could never quite turn off. Then she walked toward the transient quarters, through the lit compound, past soldiers who glanced at her and then looked again. The woman who'd been at Firebase Keller for less than a day and who already had a story attached to her that was moving through the compound the way stories move through forward operating bases, fast, imprecise, growing with each telling. She didn't hear any of the versions. She was already thinking about Monday, about the work, about the thread in the ashfang that ran somewhere worth following, and the network that didn't know she existed, and the receiver she was going to build next. Better than the last one, the way each version had been better than the one before, because she had the time to improve it, and the reasons to, and no one had ever needed to give her permission to be good at the things she was good at. She'd never waited for permission. That had always been the point. She pushed open the door to the transient quarters, set the Barrett against the wall with the deliberate care she gave it regardless of how tired she was, sat on the edge of the cot, and was asleep before she'd finished the thought she'd started. Outside, Firebase Keller ran through its night cycle. The compound hummed. The radios transmitted. The ashfang sat dark and dense and enormous on the horizon, indifferent to everything that had happened inside it and everything that was going to happen next. And somewhere in a planning room with the door closed, 3 men were looking at a call sign on a screen and following a thread that a woman in a tree had pulled out of the dark. The people the world overlooks are often the ones the world depends on, and the ones brave enough to act on what they know, when it costs them everything to do it,